operations, we're going to develop a list of every single space in this building, and this is a very small piece of what probably was 20 times longer than this for a medium-sized jail of, here's public entry, visiting, and it goes on and on and on. Each space, how big it is, how many of them there are. And once we have an idea about that, we can begin to look at how these spaces relate to each other, how they're organized, how you move from one to the other, whether you can see from one to the other. For example, these are just very simple diagrams of possible arrangements for housing units that have an officer station looking at some varied number of day rooms and or cells. And we'll see pictures of that illustrate this. But this is kind of how you start thinking about it. And it's a diagram like this that begins to generate the staffing pattern and staffing requirement that shows you where the staff person is in relation to the inmate living areas. Oh, we do, I think that is fun. We do call them bubble diagrams because they're somewhat bubble-shaped. As we go on through the programming process, a great deal of detail concerning all the, kind of everything you can imagine about a space. I mentioned size and that, but you know, clearly we're talking about a secure facility, so that means not only specifying the building fabric, that's the stuff it's made out of, and making sure that people can't pick away at it and work their way through a wall, but also the hardware like locks and hinges, the doors, the security systems for communication and surveillance. A great deal of thought and discussion goes into that before an architect even draws a line on paper. I will show you some pictures of some other technologies that that we build into a jail today. I'm not going to show you that many. It could be a whole talk, kind of all on itself. And I think I'm going to just kind of gloss over the rest of this unless there's a question. Oh, there is a question.
What is SEPTED?
Oh, did I not spell it out? It is crime prevention through environmental design, and it relates to kind of mostly the site planning, although you could apply the principles inside the jail. And it has a lot to do, for example, with things being visible and well lit and not blocking views and things like that.
It's been around for like 30 years, hasn't it?
It has. Sure. Yes.
Hi, how you doing? I just came in from the political function on the street, and I'm a little bit late. Did you mention as far as what you had in mind in terms of the specific amount of beds and the amount of cost? Because I've heard everything from 600 beds to 2,500 and 70 million to 170. So what's the real story here?
I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking it because it gives me the opportunity to do a major disclaimer. I've been here for a day and a half, okay? And if I took a position, or anybody who'd been here for a day and a half took a position on those very important questions that you just asked, you should kick them right out immediately. What I did talk about a little bit before you came in, sir, was part of the process that would lead to making decisions that the county and the public could develop a consensus around about how many beds are needed, including some detailed statistical analysis and also policy questions looking at alternatives to incarceration and things like that. But so I can't answer your question. I couldn't answer your question except in terms of a process that can lead to an answer. Is that fair?
Okay, so what's the specific process for coming to the answer? What's the timeline for that?
Well, I kind of laid out the process, so I don't want to repeat it for everybody. I think this will be available online if you want to kind of look at the steps. In terms of how long it would take, I believe, I haven't been asked yet, but I believe you need some consultant help with it. And once you had that person on board, I think it would take in the range of 3 to 6 months, something like that, to come out with those answers.
Thank you.
Sure. So from one important and maybe contentious question onto another one, but I'm only talking about process, and that's site selection. And I probably left off maybe 1 or 2 things here, but in terms of the technical aspects of site evaluation and selection, there are certain issues and questions that need to be addressed and answered. How much site do we need? How big a site? And how much growth are we planning to account for? What do we need initially to build the project, and how much space for expansion over time if we think that we need it? The space is accounted for, obviously, by the buildings, outdoor use areas, such as recreation, parking space, circulation, drop-offs, landscape buffers, zones of refuge, and things like that. Where should it be? What are appropriate neighboring uses? Are there, I love these acronyms, NIMBY we all know. You know what LULU is? LULU is a locally undesirable land use. So, doesn't depend on what it is, but you know. Generally dumps, nuclear plants, and jails fall into that category. Not always jails. Not always jails. And of course, there are issues that relate to security, surrounding uses, views in and out. Access is a very important set of topics. Law enforcement has to have good access for dropping off prisoners for booking. That raises interesting questions in a county like yours that's both far-flung and has particular sort of access patterns, and law enforcement agencies coming from somewhat different directions. And so any set of site alternatives would need to be evaluated for how relatively accessible or non-accessible they are for the agencies who will be coming to them. But we also have to think about visitors and service providers. If there is a court function at the jail, then other kinds of people have to come, and we can look to the possibilities of handling some of those proceedings by video, but probably not all of them. So the question of the transport of inmates to and from the jail, from court and to other services, have to be looked at and evaluated, because there are costs and even other risks associated with them. Site selection involves a lot of technical requirements, and I know some of you have gone through some of these. There are zoning issues, topography, soils, drainage, the presence or not of utilities, or the cost of bringing utilities in, the kind of exposure and orientation of the site. We like to get light into it. We like to be able to use sun sometimes for solar issues, and then there are ecological questions like the ones addressed in an EIR, habitat and things like that. So that leads at a certain point to environmental impact reports or studies that have to be done or may have to be done, and acquisition questions. Is the land available? Does the owner want to sell? What would the cost be? Do we already own it? Maybe there's no cost. How long would it take to get it if it's not technically available? Would the county be willing to condemn it if they want it that badly? And all kinds of questions like that. So the length of time, remember, site selection was not one of the phases that I put a time range onto, because it can happen either immediately and take no time, or it can become very protracted if it's controversial or if it's an adverse condemnation or things like that. Finally, you get through all these preliminary stages, and you actually get into the design of the building, which we're finally going to show you the examples of. There are different ways, we call this procuring the building. There are different approaches to doing that. The traditional one is the first one. Architect designs it, it's put out to bid, and a contractors bid and one is selected and constructs the building. Lately, we've been looking at other methods. One that's popular some places is called design-build, where an architect team takes the project to a certain point and you put it out for design-build, and then another team that's composed of architects and contractors takes it from there and delivers the building to you at an agreed-upon price. So there is some more control compared to going out for general bidding. I don't even know if you're allowed to do that here in Washington, but are you? Yeah. So it's something that can be considered. California is doing a lot of justice projects with a kind of variation on that called construction manager at risk, where the contractor is hired early on and paid a fee. That's their fee for doing the work and the profit. But they actually, and they guarantee that you'll get it for a certain price, but they don't build it. They get sub-bids to build it within the price that they've agreed to. And we have a lot of courthouses now in California that are being constructed by this methodology. And the last one that I've mentioned is one that California is trying, and I know you've had some efforts here and maybe some successful projects too in Washington, called public-private partnerships, where you have a developer who actually probably provides the land, but puts up the financing, builds the building, probably leases it to you, but maybe sells it back to you. I mean, there are a lot of variations on it, but some government entities have found this attractive because they don't necessarily have to go out and borrow the money or bond for the money. They can pay it off over time to the developer. So you may or may not be able to do those. I don't know. I know there are some being done in Washington. The design and construction process of all the steps that we've talked about so far is pretty time-consuming. In a jail of around the scale of yours, I don't think it could be designed in less than about a year, probably a little more. Then if you go out to bid, you've got to advertise the bids, receive them back, enter into a contract. The construction on your project, I'd guess, would be in the range of a year and a half to two. I'm not sure. It depends on what the project is finally. But so you're talking a couple of years elapsed, at least, for that design and construction process once you have settled on what the project is. And then you get the building. But unlike a house where you just kind of move in the next day when the contractor's done, or sometime before the contractor's done, in my case, you actually you must go through a fairly substantial process of sort of taking ownership of the building, learning how to run these new great bells and whistles and complex tech systems that you're going to end up loving. But you've got to learn how to run them. You've got to shake everything down and make sure that everything works before you accept it from the contractor. There's a process called a punch list of the things that need to be taken care of before you actually take responsibility for the building. And all of these things take time. I think if you end up with much growth in your system, I know the county would like to see you operate a new jail with the same amount of staff you have now. Let's just say most jails end up having to hire a number of staff and train them, so that's also part of this process of preparing to move into the jail.